move on to our next and last presentation of this first part of the afternoon. The presenter is Brenna Biggs.
That's me, I'm here.
Hello?
Hi, I'm here.
Yeah, good, yeah, thank you. So, she's the Carbon Neutrality Initiative Carbon Offsets Fellow at University of California-Irvine. She recently earned her PhD in chemistry at UC Irvine and now works in the sustainability office there. She will discuss how UC Irvine purchases carbon offsets to counterbalance its carbon emissions as it aims to be the carbon neutral Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2025. Please join me in welcoming Brenna Biggs.
Thank you so much.
Be able to, yeah, thank you. You'll be able to share the screen.
Great, this looks great. Perfect. Are you able to see that?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Wonderful, thank you for that great introduction. My name is Brenna. As was mentioned, I am a former chemistry graduate student from the University of California-Irvine. I was also the Carbon Neutrality Initiative Carbon Offsets Fellow during the 2019 to 2020 year. I am extremely grateful and honored to be here today, so thank you for inviting me. I'm extremely excited to share an overview of what carbon offsets are and why my school, University of California-Irvine, in the UC system particularly, is investing in them and trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 2025. We're going to start with a brief history of carbon offsets. They picked up popularity in the late 90s after 1997, after the Kyoto Protocol was signed. Originally, this protocol had about 200 groups in it, including many different countries that were all part of the protocol. The protocol did two things. The first thing that it did was it recognized that climate change was indeed happening and that at least it was partially caused by emissions from people, known as anthropogenic emissions. Secondly, the protocol created an emissions cap for big industries, which I'm going to talk more about shortly. The protocol also introduced 6 different classes of gases that were targeted for carbon offsets, and I've put these up on the slide here as well. So these included methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, perfluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. These gases were included because they are extremely potent greenhouse gases, which means that they effectively trap heat close to our planet and have the capability to change the climate. Although the Kyoto Protocol ended in 2012, many countries still maintain the carbon caps that were set up during this time. It's also important to mention that there's still a lot of challenges with the idea of carbon offsets. First of all, there's no comprehensive database to shop for, record, or retire carbon offsets in one single location, nor is there any single standard that all carbon offsets have to adhere to. Additionally, much of the carbon offset literature I found was written mostly in the early 2000s, and so there hasn't been a lot of recent updated literature on them. It's also important to mention that even the term carbon offsets is often considered a buzz phrase and often also has a negative connotation. But it's important to realize that carbon offsets are not meant to be a permanent solution. They're supposed to just be a temporary solution. In this presentation, we're going to dive into why carbon offsets are important right now and why carbon reduced anywhere is still carbon reduced. Overall, a step in the right direction. So we're first going to start by looking at mandatory compliance, which was a direct result of the carbon cap set up by the Kyoto Protocol. Industries, big industries that fell under the Kyoto Protocol were capped at a certain amount of carbon emissions. Any amount under the cap was okay to emit, like is shown on the left of the slide. But if they exceeded that cap, they had to reduce their emissions somehow so that they would still remain under the cap. So let's say another company was well under the carbon cap, so much so that they actually had an excess of the absence of carbon. The other company that had to reduce emissions, the company on the right side of the slide, could sure use the absence of carbon like the company on the left. The company on the right is allowed to pay the company on the left for their absence of carbon. They could also invest in carbon offsets, projects that would reduce carbon somewhere else in the world. At the end of the day, carbon is carbon no matter where it gets emitted. Overall, it has a negative impact on our climate and the environment. So a carbon reduction anywhere is good. So now, after the company that was not in compliance paid the company on the left for their absence of carbon, both companies are under the carbon cap and all is well. Mandatory compliance is different than voluntary reductions. Let's say I represent a nonprofit or maybe a private company or even a co-op like REI. These typically don't have a carbon cap because they're smaller than big industries, so their emissions were not capped under the Kyoto Protocol back in the 90s. But a company like REI, which is known for sustainability, trying to represent greenness and the environment, maybe they want the general public to recognize them as being carbon neutral. In order to be recognized as carbon neutral, they would have to have zero carbon emissions, which is very difficult, if not nearly impossible, something that Chelsea mentioned in her presentation, the previous presentation. So what REI could do instead is very similar to the compliance carbon market. They could buy carbon offsets to negate their emissions. So by putting money into the carbon offset projects, they could basically be seen as carbon neutral because they are paying to reduce carbon somewhere else. Because again, carbon reduced anywhere is still carbon reduced. I've mentioned carbon offset projects a few times now, and you might be wondering what specifically these projects might look like. And most projects fall into 5 main categories that I've listed on the slide, including biosequestration, the reduction of industrial gases, renewable energy, the reduction of methane, and increasing energy efficiency. We're going to take a deep dive into each of these project types and then go into their pros and cons. So the first project type, biosequestration, these projects typically involve the planting or the protection of trees, which trap carbon in the soil and keep it from being released into the atmosphere. The second type of project, decreasing industrial gases, does exactly what it sounds like it does. It decreases gases that otherwise would be released into the atmosphere. It's important to mention that these projects are not that common because they typically do not involve or benefit local communities at a social justice level as well, which is often important for a high quality project. The third type of project, renewable energy, includes projects that involve replacing outdated infrastructure like gas lamps with solar powered versions. Projects that decrease methane typically mean trapping gases emitted at landfills, dairy farms, or from natural vents in the earth. And lastly, the last type of project is the increasing energy efficiency project, which typically involves replacing outdated energy draining infrastructure like old light bulbs or leaky pipes with better, more efficient versions. When selecting a carbon offset project, it goes through different verification steps in which purchasers should ask the following questions. The first question looks at additionality. Would the project have happened anyways? The project should be additional, meaning that it would not have happened if the purchaser did not put money into it. A project would be not additional if it were going to happen anyways. For example, if a landfill was already going to trap their methane emissions, REI would not be able to donate money and count it as a carbon offset because it was going to happen anyway without their help. The second question looks at permanence. How will the project be maintained? This is especially important for forestry biosequestration projects. It's important to determine who's going to take care of the trees, especially because it takes about 20 years for trees to really start trapping carbon in their roots and in the ground. And then after that, if they're cut down or destroyed in a wildfire, all the carbon they trapped is released back into the atmosphere, and it was kind of like it was never trapped in the first place. The third main question looks at the baseline and how the success of the project is going to be measured, which is really important to be very accurate here to make sure that projects are carried out honestly and effectively. The last major question looks at additional social and environmental impacts. If a project can empower and involve a host community in a positive way, that usually indicates a better or a higher quality carbon offset project. I'm now going to go into some of the pros and cons of each of these projects while also trying to address these different questions that we should be on the lookout for when we're thinking of purchasing a certain type of offset. So we're going to start with biosequestration. Again, these types of projects try to increase the amount of carbon that is trapped in plants, trees, or in the soil. And this could mean that the project either protects trees and plants or it plants new ones. So there's a few pros and cons I wanted to just briefly talk about. The first pro here is that there's a lot of public support. People love trees. They love the idea of greenery and plants. And so typically there's a lot of people supporting these types of projects. It's also important to point out that there's a strong environmental justice or EJ component as well. For example, in areas where there's not a lot of trees and there's a lot of concrete neighborhoods and things, those areas get really, really hot, much hotter than the surrounding areas. So by planting trees in an urban forestry project, you can actually cool down those neighborhoods for the people living in them, and that can be very helpful. The last pro I wanted to mention for biosequestration projects is that oftentimes they can protect biodiversity as well. There are quite a few cons, though, that I think are also good to point out. The first addresses permanence, and I mentioned this before. Who's going to take care of the trees? That's a very important thing to figure out, especially if trees are being planted in an area where many of the individuals depend on logging for their lifestyle. It's important that the trees are not cut down. The next con is looking at measurement over time. Trees have cycles and they sequester carbon differently throughout their lives, throughout the day, and throughout different seasons. And so that can cause some measurement issues when doing these types of projects. It's also important to point out that these projects are very location dependent. And in fact, trees planted at some latitudes are actually bad for the environment. And so we want to make sure that we're putting trees in the right places. The last major con on this type of project is leakage. Carbon that's sequestered can actually leak out over time, and so there might be less carbon being trapped than one thinks there is. We're now going to take a look at the pros and cons for industrial gas reduction. These projects can either destroy or decrease non-carbon dioxide gases that have high global warming potentials, and the pros and cons can be found here in the table. The biggest pros is that it's usually very cheap to do these types of projects, and they do get you a large number of offsets, and that does draw a lot of people to them. However, there's some pretty heavy cons here. The first is that there's few environmental justice or very little social component. It usually doesn't benefit people or a community to do this type of project. And secondly, there can be perverse incentives as well. Some groups will start creating processes in order to create these industrial gases just to then make money selling the offsets from reducing them. So you have to be very careful when purchasing this type of project. The third type of project I want to briefly go over is renewable energy projects, and these avoid emissions that would have been generated by fossil fuels. The major pros here is one, no more fossil fuels, which is a step in the right direction. There's also low operating costs once these projects get up and running. However, there's quite a few cons associated with them. The first is whether or not the projects are additional. There can be confusion between carbon offsets and renewable energy credits, or RECs, because they're verified differently and there's no clear conversion between the two. And so that can cause additionality issues right off the bat, as well as future additionality concerns, because many states and industries are pushing to have a certain percentage of their energy from renewable sources anyways. And so one has to ask the question, would this project have happened anyways? And I think that's a big concern oftentimes. There's also a high upfront cost to get these projects going, even though once they're going, they have a low operating cost. And the last biggest con here is that sometimes they can be quite controversial, especially when thinking about hydropower, because there's oftentimes some negative environmental and social impacts associated with it. I also wanted to go over projects that decrease methane. These decrease methane from uncontrolled sources like agriculture, natural vents, landfills, or other waste management activities. Some pros include the fact that you can capture and flare the natural gas, which would become CO2 instead of methane, and that's a less potent greenhouse gas, or you can capture and use it as a natural gas as a source of energy. It's also quite easy to know in this case whether the project would have happened anyways, and so it's easy to determine additionality for these projects. The major con is that sometimes by incentivizing the offsets, it disincentivizes regulations on landfills and dairy farms, and that can be counterproductive. The last project I wanted to go over is energy efficient projects, and these again increase efficiency while requiring less energy for the same output. The major pro here is that there's typically no regrets with this type of project. There's a lot of cost benefits and energy benefits to doing them, and so many people are willing to jump on board for this type of project. But one of the cons here, because it's so easy and it saves money, is that there are additionality concerns because of the cost savings. So it's important to determine whether the project would have been done anyways. The other major issue is double counting. If a business sells offsets, but then a power plant counts emission reductions, then that's a concern because it's being counted twice. The main point of offset projects is that they're a temporary solution that decreases carbon somewhere. And carbon reduced is still carbon reduced regardless of location. So this is kind of a weird analogy, but this is kind of like when you have to go buy coffee at a grocery store. So we're going to take a closer look at that analogy. Let's say we're at a grocery store looking for some ground coffee. We're in the coffee aisle and come to a crossroads. We can get a giant container of Folgers coffee for $10, or we can get a smaller bag of roasted coffee for $16. Clearly, the big tub of Folgers is cheaper, but we need to look a little closer to determine why. Which option is going to taste better in the morning? The Folgers appears to have a lower price per ounce than the boutique roasted bag. The Folgers is 24 cents an ounce, while the local roaster is over $1 per ounce. But the type of beans is really vague here. The Folgers brand does not seem to list an actual source or location where the beans were grown. It just states mountain grown and is likely a blend of beans from all over the place. However, the smaller bag lists a specific region in Guatemala where the beans were grown. Both options have the same type of roast profile, medium roast, so there's no difference there. It also appears that the boutique bag expires a little sooner than the Folgers. So this might make it kind of a hard decision. With one option, the Folgers tub, we get more bang for our buck. The other option is more expensive, but it seems to have higher quality control and it might even taste better. Tomorrow morning, if you make this for your morning cup of coffee, either option gives you coffee. Coffee is still coffee, no matter what these details tell us, which is similar to buying carbon offsets. When we consider offsets, we need to consider similar things. We take a look at price, location, type, and timeline. At the end of the day, reduction in carbon is still reduction in carbon, no matter where it occurred. But the quality of the offsets might really matter to us as purchasers, just like with the coffee. For others, it might not. This is something really important to remember as universities consider purchasing offsets. I wanted to quickly share some of the offset projects ongoing in the UC system. There are 10 campuses in the University of California system, and most, if not all of them, purchase offsets in some capacity to offset their own emissions. Many of these projects tend to occur internationally, and I wanted to share some of the ones that are funded in various African countries because there's a lot of great work that the UC system is doing over there. For example, UC emissions are offset by switching kerosene lamps to solar lanterns in Uganda and Zimbabwe, and these are great examples of renewable energy carbon offset projects. One UC campus is planting trees in Cameroon for their forestation biosequestration offset project. 2 UC campuses are also replacing charcoal cook stoves in Rwanda and Uganda with cleaner wood burning ones. These are examples of projects that increase energy efficiency. In order to reach carbon neutrality by 2025, the University of California-Irvine, my alma mater, needs to take concrete steps to decrease and offset emissions. How heavily the university will rely on these carbon offsets depends on the type of emissions that they're trying to offset. So for example, Scope 1 emissions are emitted directly from the campus, such as during heating and cooling infrastructural processes. Scope 2 emissions are mostly from electricity produced off-site that we as a campus purchase to power the school. UC Irvine needs to reduce their emissions as much as they can first by updating infrastructure and campus practices, but then they will still need to purchase offsets to reduce about 1/3 of these emissions in order to get to carbon neutral. Scope 3 emissions occur outside of the campus boundary, but as a result of the campus. These emissions are mostly from daily transportation to and from the school, as well as any flights to conferences, sports competitions, etc. The campus plans to offset quite a large percentage of these emissions. Based on feedback from other universities around the country that are pursuing or have achieved carbon neutrality, the best way to foster student support is to pursue offsets that are mission consistent. So in the case of UC Irvine, this means that we should search for offsets that are closer to home, closer to the Orange County area. And these could directly benefit students and the surrounding community. And then from there, when those projects are exhausted, the campus can expand their search to the rest of California, the country, and internationally. A wider range of offsets is also ideal rather than just getting them from one source or project type, because it allows for more collaboration and research opportunities. It's also important to point out that carbon reduced anywhere is still carbon reduced. Thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks really for a very interesting deep dive into these certificates. And I think this had been a question in a lot of people's mind. And at the beginning of the today's presentations. I think Chad also talked about some of these concerns that he is looking into. I wanted to ask you, you touched upon the social justice aspects of this, and that sort of caught my attention because I do believe that when we are looking for these certificates, we tend to look for countries where some of the projects could be initiated and funded. And I get the argument that carbon reduced anywhere is carbon reduced. And I think your ending point was we need to look at actually doing these carbon reduction activities near us before we start getting into these kind of, I would say, far locations and plant trees or do some greenhouse gas reduction, etc., activities in some of those old technologies, etc., etc. So the question is, should there be some move for including these social justice aspects into evaluating these activities? Because especially when you are trying to do it in a civilized world with technologies that sometimes have reduced, I guess, some activities that they just cannot get out of. What are your thoughts on that?
So just to sort of summarize your question, you're curious if the social justice component should be sort of required when doing carbon offsets, or did I misunderstand the question?
In evaluating the carbon offsets, so
Okay.
I mean, some sort of a quantification that could be included in that.
That's a great question. So right now there is no such thing. And I think it depends on the verification process that you're using. There could be some, third-party verifiers that would take that into account. For a higher quality offset, that would be something that's included. To me, I feel like that's a huge component of it. Even when we look at the pillars of sustainability, I believe that social aspect is one of the pillars of sustainability. And so if we're talking about carbon neutrality, the whole point is trying to be sustainable in the long run. And I think that's not just the environment that we're concerned about, we're also concerned about the people aspect as well. Right. And so I think that's a very important point that you brought up. And it's certainly a challenge, especially when some projects are as easy as slapping a filter on the exhaust of some project, and that doesn't really often benefit people. It can if there's an air quality component to it, but oftentimes these gases, they may not affect the people living there. But I just feel like, that should definitely be something that's included. And I think part of the problem is too, as I mentioned in the beginning, there is no one standardized system verifying or evaluating all carbon offsets. They're all kind of using different systems, and not all of them value the social aspect as much as others. So I think moving down the line, it'd be really cool if there was one place, one system where everything could get evaluated the same way, and that was a component of it.
Yeah. Chad, you always raise some really good points. So why don't you please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question? I would really appreciate that. Yes, thank you.
Well, it wasn't as much a question as a comment. In our deep dives and looking at the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, time and time again, equity is often loses out. And especially to the people with the least amount of means and the least amount of capital, social capital, all types of capital. And so when you're looking at offsetting, it seems to be, I know local is best, and we've talked about that in sustainability for decades, but it seems like if you are working with developing countries, you're addressing those reduced inequalities of 10, but you're also hitting biodiversity and clean energy and all these other places, which really, really often get neglected. Now, I know there are pockets within developed countries that also have social inequalities as well, but it seems like for once, maybe local isn't necessarily always best because of these SDG goals not getting hit, especially equity in developing countries.
Yeah, so I was, Chad, my question was actually related to, Brenna mentioned that there are things like fluorocarbons and others, which when locally emitted, actually they are dangerous for the local communities. And that's where my question was aimed at, because especially for greenhouse gas emissions, purchasing certificates, I thought it's good, but it is not a long-term strategy for benefiting local communities. That's really what I was asking about. And I think situation should be improved locally as well when we are looking at offsets. That was really the question to Brenna, and of course to you, Chad. So, but there is one more question. Anne, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. It was really easy to follow and very informative.
Thank you.
There's a builder that is local here, and one of the things he's trying to do, and I can't remember the name of the kind of wood he does, but he somehow bonds wood in 3 different directions to make it stronger, so he can build pretty much all wood, keep the concrete at a minimum. And he feels that that's keeping the carbon within the tree sequestered within a building, so it's not decaying in the forest. And if you do proper forest management, that he's actually helping the environment by doing that. And you mostly talk about trees as sequestering in the soil. So what do you think about his thinking?
That's fascinating. I have not heard of that before, so that's news to me. Typically in the past, when I've seen these biosequestration projects, they all involve plants in the ground. And so that's fascinating. I haven't heard of that project. The one thing I would say that I would be curious about, and I have no knowledge of this, so I might be totally wrong, but I've also heard that over time, concrete does some weird things. Like concrete can let out carbon, but it can also sequester, and I've heard both. And so it'd be interesting over time to compare the wood buildings to a traditional concrete building and just see the difference there. I'd be curious to know, but that does sound like a fascinating project. And if it's sequestering in the building, I feel like it's probably a very similar, it would count as a biosequestration project. I think the only issue there still is permanence. You know, what happens to the building? Is the building going to remain there forever, for example? It's kind of hard to say. So, but yeah, that sounds fascinating. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I do know that there are some concretes that they're trying to create, that they are creating, because I believe Amazon or somebody like that is giving money to a company that's creating a concrete that pulls in carbon dioxide, and they're going to give them the money to develop it and then use it themselves. But yeah, this local builder is going out of his way to try to sequester the wood itself. So you talk about the sequestration in the soil, but there's also sequestration within the wood, right?
That's I guess if that's what he's saying, I totally believe it. I haven't heard of the project and I would need to look more into it, but it sounds like that would count towards that type of project.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So there's actually another question on permanence. Greg, do you want to ask it by unmuting yourself, or? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my question really, I think there's probably some skepticism about offsets, and I can definitely understand the social benefits by doing projects in developing countries, but how do you guarantee or verify that they're permanent? You talk about the issue of permanence. For example, the trees in Cameroon or the solar lamps, how do you know they last to the next year, for example, or 10 years or 50 years?
That's a great question. So that's going to depend from what I've seen on the verification process. And there's different third-party groups that verify these offsets. And so each one kind of has a different way of evaluating permanence. That being said, the tree type projects, like the biosequestration projects, typically need to have some sort of verified caretaker over a certain period of time. That period of time changes depending on the third-party verifier. As far as stuff like the solar lamps or different installations of energy efficiency and things, I think that's looking more at the fact that you've replaced something. So let's say you switch from I don't know, coal stove to a wood one or something cleaner. It's more the fact that you permanently got rid of the worse emitting one for a better one. So even if the better one breaks, it was still seen as a permanent solution because you got rid of the worse one. So in that case, that's how it would be verified. But for the trees, I think they need to specify a certain period of time. It just depends on the verifier.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, are there more questions? If not, I would really like to thank all the speakers earlier today. And Brenna, thank you very much for participating in this very interesting session and presenting your talks. Really appreciate it. And looking forward to keeping in touch and understanding how you are practicing these in various areas. Yeah, thank you. So with that, I will transfer to Ginger, and we'll get into our next part of the program here.
Okay.
Ginger?
Yes, so thank you. So before we move to the next section, let's take a 5-minute stretch break, and we will start back with our posters at 2:50.